Brace yourself. Gonna pass up anytime now. Collect yourself. Things will never be the same in a sad, sad world. Walk around the light a bit, trying to make the pieces fit to a puzzle with a million missing pieces. When I'm feeling fine is when I discover that I'm afraid to blow my cover, and there's something very wrong with this. So slip back in your hole.
Hello, everybody. Welcome here. Welcome. This is Mr. Childers. Welcome to Introduction to Ethics. We are in Module 7 of the course, where we explore the ethical issues connected to immigration, and then in a broader sense, the ethical issues connected to race. And today we're looking at people's experiences of race, and I want to share a story with you. It's about a guy I know very well. I won't share this person's name, but he's a white guy like me, and long in the past, when he was much, much younger, while he was in college, the guy found himself having on the wrong side of the law. Ended up doing some hard time. Well, one night's hard time. Ended up spending the night in jail anyway. So this is, my goodness, this is years and years and years ago. Started out on a night like this. Young dude, this is not, these are not pictures of the person I'm talking about, but started out on a night of hard drinking. Not necessarily, certainly not the wisest way to use one's time. I should say that intoxicating substances, I've made the choice, intoxicating substances are not a part of my life and haven't been for years, though I am 44 years old, and 44 years, you have the opportunity to do a lot of things. But this is way back in the past, and this young man I know was having a good time out drinking with his friends. And we'll set aside the ethical question of whether getting intoxicated is ethically acceptable or not. If one does go out and have a night like this, and then it's time to go home, what's one supposed to do? Or better yet, what is one not supposed to do? Well, what one is not supposed to do is get behind the wheel of a car. But this young guy, old enough to know better, but no offense to my young students, but too young to be particularly wise, did exactly what he's not supposed to do. So driving drunk on the street, and before too long, he saw the police lights in the rearview mirror. Pulled into a gas station, kind of pulled up in front of the gas pump, and the officer of the law knocks on the window. It was an Indiana State Trooper, and the officer said, "Son, have you had anything to drink tonight?" And the man said what every man in that predicament says, one or two, maybe. Police officer ran him through all the tests. Turned out, no, he'd had far more than one or two drinks. This is a coconut LaCroix, by the way. I'm not acting out this young man's intoxication. He'd had far more to drink than one or two drinks, and so he was placed under arrest for driving while intoxicated. Now, I know two things about the state trooper that arrested this young man. One, the state trooper was doing his job, and the state trooper was not wronging this young man in any way. The young man deserved to be placed under arrest. And two, I know that this state trooper was an incredibly kind and considerate person, because when he handcuffed this young man, he handcuffed him in the front of his body instead of the back of his body, so that as he rode in the car, he wasn't sitting with his fists, jammed into his spine. He allowed the man to sit in the front seat of the car, right next to himself, rather than in the back seat behind a cage. And before they pulled off to the police station, to the county jail, the officer said, "Hang on a minute, son. And the officer went and parked the young man's car in the parking lot so that it wouldn't be towed. Normally, when someone is arrested for driving under the influence, the car gets towed away to the impound, and then the state gets another, I don't know, $500 for just keeping somebody's car overnight. But this police officer was incredibly kind and considerate. In the years and years that have passed since this story took place, as the conversation in our nation has shifted and developed over the past decade, especially, there's a question that this young man, now an older man, and I myself can't help but ask, would this young man's experience have been the same if instead of looking kind of like this, he had looked like this? If he were a young, drunk black man instead of a young, drunk white man, would the police officer have cuffed him in the front? Would the police officer have let him ride in the front seat? Would the police officer have courteously parked the young man's car to ensure that it didn't get towed so that when he was released the next morning, he could just walk back to the gas station and pick up his car? Now, look, I'm certainly not saying that the police officer was a racist. I don't know that. I don't have any reason to suspect that. But I can't help but wonder if the experience of this young man, this young white man, being treated so well by the police might not be an example of what is often called in current conversations in our civilization white privilege. White privilege. So those who allege that white privilege is a real and active causal force in our society tend to define it this way, as an unearned advantage based on race, which can be observed both systemically and individually. Systemically and individually. So individual racism is not difficult to envision. Hey, let's go beat this guy up because he's Chinese. It's clearly an act of individual racism. But a far more controversial and more slippery topic and harder to define is what's called systemic racism. So first, let me make an aside. This topic and all the topics we'll be discussing, all the conversations we're going to be having in modules 7 and 8 to wrap up this course on ethics are conversations that are intensely controversial in the United States today and are probably much more controversial here in the state of Florida than they are in other places. These are conversations that, if this were a high school class, due to the law in the state of Florida, if this were a high school class, and it is not a high school class, it is a college class taught on a high school campus. But if it were a high school class, it would either be the case that A, we would not be able to have these conversations, or B, the conversations would be very different. Next week, we will actually look at what are the specific regulations in Florida that determine how these conversations can take place in high school classrooms in the state of Florida, which again, I maintain that this is not a high school class, and so that these regulations do not apply to this classroom. Nevertheless, I do want to share a little preview of what we'll talk about, is that the laws as they're written in the state of Florida do not forbid all discussion of these topics. They specifically allow discussion of these topics in an objective manner, which points out what the arguments and perspectives of people are without advocating for a certain position. What Governor DeSantis has explicitly said he is trying to oppose is indoctrination. And I assure you, I am making no effort to indoctrinate you or any of my students or anyone. In almost every instance, I will not even share what my own opinion on the topics are. I will, by the end of this video, share my opinion on white privilege, though I will make it very clear that what I'm sharing is only my opinion, and you're under no obligation to share my opinion. So now back to the question, when we speak about not just racism, but systemic racism, what is alleged by those who argue that systemic racism is a real force in our society? It is alleged that the way our society is organized, the structures of our society are designed in such a manner such that the result is disadvantage to people of color and advantage to white people. That the disadvantage for people of color is simply the inevitable result of the way our society functions, the way the system functions. You'll notice that under that definition of racism, it is not necessary for there to be any actual racist individual or any actual racist action. If it is the case that systemic racism is a real force in our society, it would remain the case even if there were not a single white person who believed that white people were superior to people of color. The disadvantage for people of color would remain if it were the case that systemic racism is real. The disadvantage for people of color would continue even if there were not a single white person choosing to mistreat people of color, because it is alleged that the disadvantage to people of color is an inevitable, natural, and logical result of the way the systems of our society operate. As I reflect on that definition of white privilege, I also reflect on some experiences that I have had, and more importantly, some experiences that I have not had. So at no point in my life, ever, not once, have I been followed around a store by a suspicious looking clerk as I wander back and forth through the aisles of the store. For most of my adult life, I was poor as dirt. You know, I had no money until my late 30s. I could not afford to buy most things in most stores. Never have I felt the least bit of suspicion coming my way from the clerk of a store. I would often go into stores just to use the bathroom. And so walk out of the store, walk right through the checkout line without even stopping by the cashier. I didn't take anything. It didn't occur to me to take anything, nor did it occur to me that anyone would suspect that I had taken anything, nor was I ever hassled or even given a noticeable dirty look. I've never once in my life had that experience. I've been pulled over in traffic a number of times, not like millions and millions and millions, but again, I'm 44 years old, and inevitably things happen. Pulled over, and when and anyone who's pulled over gets nervous. What makes me nervous when I'm pulled over? Oh no, man, I forgot to renew the sticker on my license plate. I'm gonna get a ticket. I don't want to have to pay $150 or whatever, and I get nervous about that. I've never once in my life has it ever occurred to me that being pulled over by the police might result in my death. I've never had that fear. The thought has never crossed my mind. You know how, except for on a day like today, when we are specifically having a conversation, do you know how often I think about the fact that I'm white? Do you know how often my whiteness crosses my mind? Zero often. I never think about the fact that I'm white. I never think of myself as a white person. If you handed me a microphone and said, describe yourself, I could talk until I died of starvation, and it wouldn't even occur to me to mention that I'm white. It may be the case that my whiteness has had a huge impact on the way my life has turned out. But it has never been the case that my whiteness has had the slightest bit of impact on my identity. I am almost never conscious of being white. Why is that? Those who advocate for the reality of white privilege would suggest it is because in this culture, whiteness is the default setting for human. And because I am part of the majority, because I am part of what is alleged to be the privileged majority, I never have to think about my race. My identity is entirely unracialized, despite the fact that the way my life has played out is surely been impacted in many ways by that race. Is that white privilege? I wonder, and if we were present in class, we'd be, if I had students with me right now, students and I just finished two very good conversations about what white privilege means to them and whether or not they think that white privilege is a real phenomenon. There are those that deny that white privilege is a real phenomenon. And, so what do you think might be the strongest argument against the reality of white privilege? I would say that it's this. I would say that the strongest argument against white privilege is this. So here's a photo taken in rural America in Appalachia. I stayed for a time in Prestonsburg in eastern Kentucky. Particularly the Appalachian region, many other rural parts of the United States, but particularly the Appalachian region, which is it has a massive white minority, or majority, a massive white majority. It is not an especially ethnically diverse area. These are communities that are plagued with crippling poverty, with pervasive chronic unemployment due to the simple unavailability of jobs. The industry of Appalachia has long since collapsed. There are only so many people that can be hired by the Dollar General, and there are only so many dollars that the Dollar General can pay the people that it has hired. There's a region of the country plagued by chronic drug addiction, which is fueled by unethical doctors who will rent out space in shopping centers, on the other side of the Dollar General, and they'll come to town once or twice a month. They come to town when the folks get their welfare checks, and the folks will sign over the welfare checks, and the doctors will write them out their scripts and hand over their opioid painkillers. It's a region where the state of education is in grave disarray. One could reasonably point out that that public education in the state of Florida is not without its flaws, not without its troubles. But I assure you that this right here is Harvard compared to any of the public schools in Appalachia. So I ask you, my friends, does this little girl look like she lives a life of privilege? Are these people privileged? Has whiteness made these people's lives better? This is the strongest argument against It's the strongest argument against the reality of white privilege, but there is a response to that argument. And the response that advocates of white privilege bring forward is this. White privilege does not mean that white people do not have difficult lives. It means that the color of their skin is not one of the causes of the difficulty of their lives. So it would be argued and pointed out that if next door to this family, if in the trailer next door to this man, sitting on a broken down moped in front of that trailer, were a black man with his little black daughter and his black brother and his black mom sitting in a lawn chair, that the life of that family would be more difficult than the life of this family if all things were equal. So, do I think white privilege is real? Let me give you a flashing red light warning notice. What you're about to hear is my personal opinion, which I do not share very often in this course, and which I never expect you to share. There is no expectation that you will think the same thing that I think as a student in this college course. So I am not sharing this with you in order to indoctrinate you in any way, shape, or form, but this is my opinion. It seems to me that white privilege names a reality that is a vibrant and powerful force in our society. It also seems to me that it names it rather poorly. What is privilege? If privilege is when you receive something to which you were not entitled. So if I invite you over to my house for dinner, not at teacher and student, but down the road after let's say we bump into each other 10 years ago, 10 years from now, and you've become a teacher too. And so I invite you over to my house for dinner. And I don't invite John over to my house for dinner. Have I wronged John in any way? No, because John is not entitled to dinner at my house. You are not entitled to dinner at my house. I have given you something to which you are not entitled, and therefore it is a privilege. So let's get to the question that's at the heart of this. Is white privilege real? Here I'll give you the flashing red light warning. You are getting my personal opinion on this topic, and you are under no obligation to share my opinion on the topic. Is white privilege real? Well, I think the term white privilege certainly names a reality in our society. When you have voices that say that deny the very existence of white privilege, that say that there is no truth to that claim, I think those voices are peddling patent absurdity. To speak of white privilege, though, I think is to name a reality, but not necessarily to name it especially well. It's not an especially clear term. If by white privilege you mean that a white person automatically has a privileged role in society because of his or her whiteness, then that's not true at all. The homeless white man on the street who is mentally ill and addicted to drugs and suffering from syphilis does not have a privileged role in society. If that's someone's definition of white privilege, then there is no such thing. However, if by white privilege you mean that a person's whiteness makes him or her less likely to be disadvantaged in society, then I think that's something that's, I want to say, undeniably true, except that there are some who deny it. If you look, for example, at the rates of college graduation, 41% of white Americans over 25 have a college degree, 27.6% of black Americans, and 20.9% of Hispanic Americans. So there's a wide chasm there. There are even wider chasms in median wealth. If you look at incarceration rates of white Americans versus black Americans as a proportion of the population, you'll see great differences that place African Americans and many other minority populations at a disadvantage. Now, there are black billionaires and there are white homeless people. There are black women with PhDs and white women who've dropped out of fourth grade. But we're speaking on statistically, if someone is born white versus born black versus born Latino, one can predict with a certain amount of accuracy what the outcomes of that person's life, what possibilities, what likelihoods are open to that person. Let me illustrate it this way, how this type of privilege works. So my great-grandfather was born in 1911 in Mississippi. He was half white, half Cherokee. I'm not claiming, by the way, that I'm not trying to claim any person of color street cred here. I have absolutely no connection to Native American culture, but that's the position he was born in. He was a cotton farmer in the deep south of the United States. He died of stomach cancer when he was 32 years old, leaving behind 4 children, one of whom was my grandfather, who was then raised fatherless, raised by his grandmother, picking cotton during the Great Depression, and worked his way up into the middle class, blue-collar middle class life. My father was born into blue-collar middle-class life and achieved fairly highly within that range, but never moved out of blue-collar middle-class life. And when I was born, we were probably just below middle class, but then he worked himself back up into middle class. Now, and then here I am, not blue-collar. I'm a gentleman of leisure, an intellectual worker. Peeper rolls over in his grave, but decidedly middle class. That generational story of my family speaks to the likelihood of whether or not I was going to be a billionaire. If my great-grandfather had been a billionaire, it would be far more likely that I would be a billionaire. The fact that he was not, and that my grandfather wasn't, and that my father wasn't, made it far less likely that I would be. It did not dictate all my possibilities, but it would be much less likely for me to become a billionaire than someone who came from 3 generations of billionaires. Now, imagine my great-grandfather born 1911 in Mississippi. Imagine up the road a black man born on the same day. That black man would almost certainly have been born into deeper poverty than my great-grandfather. And so the generations that followed him would have had far less of a head start in being economically prosperous and successful in life. That black man would have been born into the Jim Crow era of the South, of mandated segregation and explicit racial oppression. His great-grandfather, that black man's great-grandfather, would have been enslaved. And my great-grandfather's great-grandfather was an enslaver. Neither of those realities determine automatically what the outcome for me or for my black counterpart in this example would be. But they certainly dictate the likelihoods of outcomes, in which case they dictate it in a way that is explicitly impacted by racial concerns. The whiteness, even half-whiteness of my great-grandfather directly, not alone, not with no other factors, but directly increase the likelihood of my living a more comfortable middle class life than did the blackness of his black counterpart up the street. This reality of a certain privilege that attaches to race, or again, the way I look at it is that not that whiteness determines that someone has a privileged place in society, but that whiteness is one factor that makes it more likely for someone to have a privileged place in society, because non-whiteness in this country carries with it a whole legacy of explicitly racist and oppressive laws and policies of past generations. This is not to say that the laws and policies of today are explicitly racist or oppressive, but nobody worth listening to is going to deny that our nation's laws in the past certainly were, and that continues to have an impact. This isn't ancient history. There are elderly black people today whose grandparents were born into slavery. This isn't a trillion years ago, and the weight of history is heavy, and it continues to ripple down through the ages. So, if white privilege is real in that sense, does it have a moral charge to it? Is it morally weighted? Ken Wisma, in the lecture we listened to last class period, and in the book, The Myth of Equality, that you'll be reading for the course, Ken Wisma yesterday spoke of something called corporate responsibility, that there's a sense in which we as a people who have benefited from past injustices share in the responsibility of those injustices. And he compared it to the classical Christian doctrine of original sin. I want to push, not deny, but push on this notion of corporate responsibility a little bit. The term responsibility, when we're talking about ethics and morality, can have different meanings. So imagine a person is driving drunk, gets in a car accident, and nobody else is hurt, but he kills himself in the car accident. Was his behavior irresponsible? Is he responsible for his own death? If responsible here means cause and effect, did his actions cause his death, then yes, he's responsible for his death. If we mean, does he bear moral responsibility for his death? In this example, that's a little more slippery. He certainly made a morally questionable choice in the risky and negligent decision to drive drunk. However, if he had been pulled over and arrested for drunk driving and convicted of drunk driving, we would not have thought it was just to execute him. We would not have thought that his immoral action was deserving of death. Therefore, we can't in a straightforward sense say that he bears moral responsibility for his own death. Causal responsibility, yes. Moral responsibility, certainly not in its entirety. Do we as a people who have inherited privileges that are rooted in unjust actions of the past have causal responsibility? Well, of course not. We can't travel through time. I didn't cause any of the injustices. Do we bear moral responsibility? Here's where I want to push on Ken Wisma's claim of corporate responsibility. You know, to whatever extent white privilege is real, it is something that a white person possesses from the moment he or she is born. If there is a moral responsibility, if there's an inherited immorality, an inherited guilt, it would mean that the newborn white infant is somehow to blame, responsible, and ought to be punished for injustices done, not even injustices that are done today, but injustices that were done decades and centuries ago that continue to have implications today. I'm very resistant to this concept of corporate responsibility, especially if it's interpreted as guilt. If I steal your wallet, if I'm your teacher, you're my student, and I steal your wallet, and you catch me. Well, yeah, I have to give the wallet back, and I'm going to be punished. Am I going to do jail time for stealing a wallet? Maybe a little bit. I'm going to be fired, and I'm going to lose my teaching certification. So I'll lose not only my job, but my ability to work in the career that I love. And all of that will be justified. I will deserve all those consequences. I am morally responsible for my choice. I'm guilty for my choice. If you go home tonight and there's a knock on your door, and this doesn't matter whether you're white or black or Latino or Asian, Arab, it doesn't matter. There's a knock on your door, and standing at the door is a Seminole, a member of the Seminole Native American tribe that used to live here in Florida. And the Seminole says, this land belonged to my ancestors for hundreds of years. And your ancestors, whether they be the ancestors of your family, or at least the people who came before you in your nation, took this land from my ancestors. And now I command you to leave your home because you are benefiting, you are privileged, you are benefiting from the injustices that were done to my ancestors. I want your home, get out. Well, everything he's alleged is true. The land was taken from his ancestors by, if not our flesh and blood ancestors, by our precursors operating under the authority of the United States of America and the state of Florida. Unjustly, unjustifiably, immorally taken from his ancestors. And whether we're white, black, Latino, Arab, Asian, doesn't matter. We have inherited the privilege of living on that land. We have inherited the benefits of the injustices done to others. Are you responsible for that? Do you share in some corporate responsibility for that? Are you morally responsible for that? Do you have to give them your house? Here I push back that the voices that want to suggest that we are guilty for things that we ourselves have not done, those voices are dangerous. Those voices are pushing a message of cultural self-hatred, and they are pushing a message of moral absurdity. If I am able to be held morally guilty for something that I have not done, then the very notions of guilt and innocence, morality itself, have collapsed into meaninglessness. Is there a middle ground? Is there another sense of responsibility? Is there a sense in which, because I have inherited privileges from the injustice done to others in the past, do I bear some future responsibility to use this privilege in ways to help ensure a more just and peaceful society tomorrow, to help make sure that injustices like the ones from which I benefit don't occur again? Well, I think that's a noble goal for any person, and I think that may be a fruitful place to have a fruitful perspective from which to have the privilege conversation.
Walk around a lot a bit, trying to make the pieces fit to a puzzle with a million bits and pieces. When I'm feeling fine is when I discover that I'm afraid to blow my cover, and there's something very wrong with this. So slip back in your hole, or get back in your cave. If I'm going down, I'm taking someone